Thank you all for coming. I'm Debbie Bates, President of the Knowing Historical Society. And it's always a wonder, as everyone's sitting and eating and enjoying and talking, how we're going to get the tables out and the chairs set up and the program underway. But without too much delay, I think we're going, thanks to lots of able workers. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Ollie Porter, who is on our program committee. So introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Well, most of you have got the hint of Captain Patton is here, a graduate of the Naval Academy with high honors in 1960. He hails from Walpole, Mass, and he had a distinction right out of the academy of going right into the nuclear power program. Prior to that, you had to serve on surface ships to show your mettle, and then could go into the submarine nuclear power program. So he led the way on going right out of school into the rigors of Admiral Rickover's training. He ended up serving on 5 attack submarines and a couple boomers, commanded the Pargo, and had a number of duties at the sub school and tactics, and ended up at the War College in a gaming capacity. Retired in '85 and immediately formed a company, the Submarine Tactics and Technology, and has worked in the area as consultant on a number of different programs. Perhaps he'll go down in the history books as one of the submarine technical advisors to the Paramount Pictures when they made The Hunt for Red October, which is a very dramatic submarine picture. Jim is here. I went to one of his presentations and thought it would be good, and have received some wrath from those submariners that are in the community. Why didn't you ask me? But Jim has the presentation together, and perhaps more importantly, he's on a program to help the North Stonington schools, and ask if we would make a contribution of that, which we will do as a token for his coming and sharing with us a great deal of work he's got. I think you'll find it fantastic. If you notice, the electronics already is quite impressive. So without further ado, here's Captain Jim Patton.
Thanks, Ollie. I can attest to the fact that there was a lot of flack about why the hell they had to go all the way to North Stonington and get somebody to talk about submarines when Mike Hewitt was right across the street. Mike and I were shipmates a long time ago in another distant galaxy. The centerpiece of this presentation is going to be a 16-minute video that Walter Cronkite narrates. And this was put together between 1999 and 2002. The Smithsonian Institute American History section had this marvelous 3,000 square foot display called Past Attacks and Boomers, submarines in the Cold War. I was involved with the committee, Navy Submarine League and the Smithsonian that put this thing together. And one of the things we did, we went to the Office of Naval Intelligence and said, can you declassify some stuff to make this more interesting for the general public? So they really did declassify some stuff. So part of the message of this presentation is there's a lot of stuff we can talk about now. Mike Hewitt can talk about it, I can talk about it. We didn't used to be able to talk about it. I went down to a Navy Historical Society presentation Submarine League does every year about some aspect about submarines. This year they did about SOSAs. And they talked about stuff in our day you couldn't have mentioned in mixed company. To include the fact that, we had both oceans ringed with these sound surveillance sonars that captured, sound get captured in the deep sound channel. And just to highlight what it was capable of, and this all came out in the presentation that they gave unclassed, that the first of many, many stations was opened in Barbados in the early 50s. And no sooner they opened it, they turned it on, and there's a Soviet nuclear submarine November class came around the corner up there at North Cape on northern tip of Norway, and they picked him up 5,000 miles away. Okay, so that set the tone. So what Mike and I did was pretty damn easy. Because we had such a technical advantage you wouldn't believe. We'll talk about it a little bit as we move on. It We couldn't talk about it. So now we can. So we should talk about it a little bit. You guys should know what some of your tax money was going for. And you'll like this presentation in the middle part by Walter Cronkite, because it's got some really neat stuff about it. I won't spoil it by telling about it now. Okay, here's the kind of environment that Mike and I lived under. You know, where'd you go? Nowhere. What'd you do? Nothing. I was in Pearl Harbor on a submarine, living in Navy housing. My wife struck up a friendship with the gal next door, and the gal next door is saying, "Oh, my husband, he was on a destroyer, brought me this back from China, brought me this back from Japan, brought me this back." I said, "What does your husband bring you back?" She said, "Dirty underwear." But typically, we'd sail port to port, home port to home port. And 60 days in between, where'd you go? Nowhere. What'd you do? Nothing. Tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about where did we go and what did we do. Okay? It was interesting stuff. There have been a number of times in the submarine force history, they say, well, that's it, we don't need submarines anymore because there's no more need for what you did. What did we do in World War I? Pretty much nothing but watch the Germans and say, geez, you know, they got something going there. Between World War I and World War II, we built a bunch of coastal submarines to defend the shores. Well, real thinkers within the submarine force said, I don't think we're going to have to defend the shores. I think we're going to have to go a long way and stay there a long time. So they lobbied for a very, by that standards of the day, a huge submarine, 300 foot long, you know, fleet boat, 1,800 tons. The best submarine in the world at that time was the German Type 7C, which was about 700 tons. Almost 3 times as big. The reason they were able to sell that is that a mission that had involved was, let's take submarines along with the fleet so they can do the scouting for us and find the targets and say, hey, battleship's right here. And they have to be able to keep up with the fleet, so they have to be able to do 18, 20 knots on the surface. Well, just like sailboats, a ship has a hull speed. If you want to do 18 and 20 knots economically, without having to drive uphill up your bow blade, then you've got to be 300 foot long. So we built these 300 foot long submarines, and lo and behold, when the fleet went away on 7 December 42, we had something that could carry enough fuel to go all the way downtown to the Sea of Japan and stay there for a month and get on home. We had submarines that had enough space and weight reserve that as we developed radars, we developed electronic support measures, other equipments, we had room to put them on. Germans didn't. Okay, when they started getting hammered by the B-24s flying with radar, their radar interception equipment was a wooden frame with wire wrapped around it, wires going down the hatch on the bridge to a radio. And they're trying to catch the radar pulses with some kid up there turning this wooden frame around. We had real electronics that heard the Japanese radars coming so we could get down. Throughout our career, one of the things that was and remains very, very important, probably the most important mission, is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR. We were doing it in the Pacific in the 30s. We were looking at all those islands as the Japanese were fortifying. So it wasn't any surprise when the Marines weren't sure what was there. They had pictures to look at. Okay? And you can take that thread any way you want. But if you wanted this guy named Heisenberg, who developed, he got a Nobel Prize, a nuclear physicist, developed something called the uncertainty principle. Okay, what it says essentially is, you can't measure something without affecting it. That's true unless you measure it and observe it covertly. So every time an airplane or surface ship or something is observing something, it affects it. When the submarine observes it, that's what it really is. No satellites ever saw the Pakistanis drilling a hole down to set off their first nuclear device. Okay? There were lots of things that the only time... I was a JO on my first ship, which was a Scorpion. And we're periscoped out, and we'd been sent out for something. This was in '62. And the captain calls me over and he says, Jim, you like airplanes, what am I looking at? And I looked out there at a merchant ship and I said, that's the fuselage of an IL-28 Beagle Soviet medium jet bomber. He said, yeah, and it's going to Cuba. That was the first hard evidence we had of what was under those tarps. Every time an airplane flew over, Here's these Soviet ships heading to Cuba, but everything's covered with canvas. Okay, now we saw what it was, took some pictures, sent them home, and you know the rest of the story from that. Okay. Vietnam, an awful lot of submarines are very good at supporting special forces. And you would not think that a submarine or a special forces guy would have much in common. There's a tremendous amount of rapport. Because we both plan to an extreme. You know, our wives hate us because we got plan B, C, and D, and E. And what do you do then? But then the special forces, they aren't crazy guys that go out on the, well, they have planned that down to the minute. And they don't mind at all with some Army captain and there's some private checking the Army's gear, captain's gear to make sure it's on right. And on a submarine, you know, you got officers checking the enlisted guys checking the officers. Special forces really like the fact that an enlisted guy rigged the escape trunk and an officer checked it, and it was right before they got in it. And, you know they're not going to drown because some valve wasn't in the right place. Yom Kippur War. Everybody gets scrambled for that. But I had a good friend that was CEO of something called Spadefish. He got scrambled and sent to the Mediterranean. Now, the Mediterranean is full of warships at this point. Okay, Soviet warships, U.S. warships, French, Brits, whatever. But the thing that he remarked at is the Mediterranean has a history of being a very, very noisy body of water. You can't hear anything. There's so much noise. Yom Kippur became very quiet because all the merchant ships and everything get out of the way. If you had a contact, it was a military vessel. Okay, so there's later on when we had something called Cold War at Sea Day up at Naval War College and Brown University put on this 3-day affair. A bunch of Soviet, Russian admirals, submariners, a bunch of U.S. submariners, admirals, Kaltros, an ex-chief of naval operations was there, he'd been my XO on one of my submarines. And we were telling sea stories about the Cold War. You know, and we met one of the guys that was the CEO of one of the Foxtrots that got sent down to Cuba. And he was describing that it was 140 degrees on that ship when they were snorkeling. Now, they weren't designed for tropical waters. They had no radio communications with the motherland at all. And all they knew about what was going on was what they heard on U.S. radio and TV broadcasts through the interpreter they had aboard. They had 2 nuclear warheaded torpedoes aboard each of them, with permission to use them if attacked. And we're throwing these practice PDCs at them, practice depth charges, and boom, boom, boom. So that was a close run thing. Of those 4 submarines, 1 broke down, had to turn back. 2 got surfaced, because we kept them down long enough that the batteries wore out and they had to come out. And he was the skipper of the only submarine that didn't break down, didn't surface, and he finally went home. He said they didn't know maybe they're going to get shot when they get home, because obviously this thing was a bust. It didn't work. But he's a neat old guy. He's in his 80s. Later on, there was a CIA guy up talking about how clever the Soviets were from an engineering and science point of view. They were the first ones that started coating their submarines with rubbery kind of stuff to cut down on the reflection from sunlight. Okay? And we didn't know about it until one of our submarines and one of their submarines had a collision. And we surfaced, we're looking around, and here's this rubbery stuff. He said, what the hell is this? Bring it home. And this old timer raised his hand. He said, yeah, that was me you ran into. I was the CO of a Victor class SSN by then, you know, and I was trying to find and trail the USS George Washington, a ballistic missile submarine, and you guys ran into me. I said, oh. But anyway. And then the anti-SSBN ops, you know, that's the hunt for October stuff. And we'll talk about that a little more. But here's what sums it up. You know, the most important submarine mission has changed 3 or 4 times during the lifetime of submarine. Okay? And what a JO trains for early in his career is nothing like what he's going to do when he's in command. And we're unique in the fact that we design in transformation ability. We build a submarine knowing that whatever mission we thought we built it for isn't what it's going to be doing during the middle of its life and towards the end of its life. Okay, and we've been very, very successful. extremely successful. Now, like I said, there's a lot of stuff now you can pick up and read. Some of it's garbage, you know, but some of it's not too bad. The Hunt for Red October thing, people always ask me, you know, where did he get his information? Oh, Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman down in Maryland. He lived in a neighborhood where there were a bunch of ex-submariners who worked for the local power plant. And he put two and two. He's a smart guy. Put two and two together. And a funny story when it comes to that. When I was XO, the guy that was my CO was a guy named Bruce DeMars. And later on, and I just retired, at this point, Bruce DeMars is a three-star vice admiral. And he's the senior submariner in the Pentagon. Oppo 2, we used to call him. And so my wife and I are down at his house in the Navy Yard. And Bud Carter, who is sublant, and his wife are there. Carter is about to retire. And but DeMars looks at Carter and I and said, either are you guys interested in being the technical consultant to Paramount for the Hunt for Red October movie? And I said, okay. Carter says, yeah. And I said, oh, me too. I said, you know, 3-star, 4-star. Months or so later, DeMars calls me up and he says, you're still interested? And I said, how much do I have to pay him? So he gave my name, we struck a deal, and I saw him at a cocktail party, fall cocktail party down in D.C., and I said, thanks for getting me that job. He said, I didn't do that because I like you. I said, well, okay. He said, I did that because you offer us credible denial. And I didn't understand what that meant because Ollie North hadn't happened yet. But it meant that if this thing really went south and was really a disaster, they didn't even know me. And it's hard to deny knowing this retired vice admiral, you know. But it was fun. It was about a 3-year gig, and I worked with 3 different screenwriters in the series and then the production and all. But the story behind it, how the submarine force pulled out all the stops, it should be evident on watching the movie. We did everything for them. We sent all the actors to sea, we sent the director, the producer to sea. And the reason that is that DeMars was sitting in his office one day and this lawyer comes in and he's representing Paramount. And he says, can you help us find a technical consultant for the movie? And he says his first impulse was to say, go get Clancy, he knows everything about submarines. You know, we don't cooperate with anybody, let alone movie companies. But what had happened was Top Gun. And Top Gun had happened, and it creamed our recruitment of top-notch people from the Naval Academy and other NRTC colleges. A bunch of guys went home on Christmas leave, all signed up for nuclear power training, came back and said, oh, no, I want to be a pilot. So I said, this is our chance to get even. So they pulled out all the stops, and we did get even. Yeah. You know, it's a better movie. This is a marvelous book. It's out of print. I've got a copy, and I regard it very much. But this guy got hired by a touchy-feely peacenik group to prove why it was foolish that, you know, we should be threatening one another's ballistic missile submarines, because that was a stabilizing thing. He did an incredibly good technical review of all the detectability issues, non-acoustics, every imaginable thing. And he came down to the conclusion, which the people who funded him kind of discredited, this is not the opinion, no, that sort of thing. He said, you know, the way I see it is the Soviet SSBNs are totally vulnerable, and US SSBNs are totally invulnerable, which is counterintuitive to the normal person. They think, no, wait a minute, these are the same kind of things, you know. I can understand something being 10%, plus or minus 10% better or worse than something else of the same gender. But we're going to get to something here in a bit. I'll come out with it. Mike and I had 40 dB acoustic advantage. What does that mean? What's the 10 times the logarithm of ratio? 10,000 to 1 ratio of goodness of something. Now, but having a 10,000 to 1 advantage in anything, you ought to be able to have a credible showing. You know, it meant on the given day, with a given environment, with a given target, the guy I would hear 100 miles away would not hear me till I was a mile away. Okay? And if you got to go fight, that's the kind of advantage you want to have. Blind Man's Bluff. You've probably all read that. If you haven't, you know of it. But that's worth reading. And the submarine forces stand on that as neither confirm nor deny some of the stuff they say in it. But it's worth reading, and I'll tell you, the first thing a submariner does when he picks that book up, he goes to the back and see if his name's in there. See if he's referenced. These two people started off, in fact, I was interviewed by them, they started off trying to pull the thread to see if there was any connection between duty on a nuclear submarine and cancer. So they interviewed a whole bunch of submariners. Did you have cancer? Did you have cancer? Did you know anybody have cancer? Did they serve on submarines? And they kept getting whiffs of Cold War kind of stuff, and they shifted their focus. And they probed into what were submarines doing during the Cold War. And it's an interesting book. Very interesting book. The display I just talked about, we're going to see more about that. This was that Cold War at sea. That was a great conference. In fact, the third day of that, the interesting thing, that was put together by two people. One was Francis Gary Powers Jr., okay, who lives in Warwick, and the other was Khrushchev's son, who teaches at Brown. And to watch these two guys, big buddies, and hugging, you know, this was, wow, things have really changed. But the third day of that marvelous day of presentations and sea stories and all, we celebrated up on the Juliet class SSG, missile shooting diesel submarine, that was in Providence before it sank. And one of the now Russian admirals that was there celebrating, and it was on Victory Day, big deal in Russia. Victory Day is the end of World War II. And one of the Russian admirals had been the CEO of that very ship. Okay, so it just was an incredible thing. And lots of comments have come out by very high-ranking U.S. officials, and a lot of things we can talk about. Now, what you're going to see on this 16-minute video, some of the things we got declassified. You'll be watching what they call mission video. This is an SSN in international waters, but in close proximity to the, you're obliged to stay in international water, which is 12 miles out. But you're watching a Soviet cruiser through the periscope as he gets ready and fires a surface-to-air missile against a drone coming by. They intersect, they blow up, and pieces fall down all around the ship. And it's, ho-hum, we got everything we need? Yeah, okay, fine, let's go back down deep. But this is real video taken on a real submarine, watching a real Soviet cruiser. And we had every right to be there, but they didn't know we were there. There was a guy named Kennard McKee, retired as a four. He was the guy who relieved Rickover as the head of naval reactor. Retired as a four-star. He was first CEO of submarine Dace, which was a Thresher-class submarine. He was the first guy to deploy with a paraviz capability, the ability to make video recordings through the periscope. So he comes back from a successful deployment, and as guys who do have a successful deployment do, he is debriefing Commander Submarine Force Atlantic Fleet, Vice Admiral. So I tell him, we did this, we went there, we did this. And he reaches over and he turns on his VCR. And what's shown on the TV now is under the hull of a Soviet warship that he circled around with a periscope 6 or 8 feet from the bottom of the ship. And that's interesting, and his this and his that. So the Vice Admiral's looking at it and says, McKee, who the hell told you could do that? He said, nobody told me I couldn't. The real wisdom, and I was advised this early in my career, never ask the question you don't want to hear the answer to. Right. Okay? So he didn't ask the question, did that. Subland looks at that and he says, well, I guess we're going to have to train everybody how to do that. I learned how to do it, Mike learned how to do it, everybody learned how to do it. It's fun. And this really surprised me. There was, whenever you declassify something, you typically hold back something. If you're going to talk about the name of the ship, then you don't talk about the time or the place. If you're going to talk the place, then you don't, you keep some of your cards. What they declassified was a classic trail by the Batfish. Times, dates, locations, the whole track. And you'll get a chance to see that thing. I was really amazed they declassified that. And then just a whole bunch of other hardware that was there in the display. They are putting the display together again. You know, they took it down in 2002. They're putting it together again at the Navy Yard down in southeast Washington. So if you ever get down there and you have some hours to spend and go look at it, boy, it's well worth it. It is marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. Okay, now is the real test of my computer skills here.
We'd won it, and what most of us wanted was to get on with our lives. But it was more complicated than that. The world had changed. Europe and Japan lay in ruins. And now there were only two superpowers, the United States and its former ally, the Soviet Union. In 1945, only the United States had the atomic bomb, but not for long. By the end of the 1940s, the Soviet Union also had atomic bombs of its own. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a conflict that came to be known as the Cold War. Like any war, it brought a time of mutual fear and distrust. But unlike a hot war, such as World War II, the Cold War would not be decided on the battlefield. The United States and its West European allies feared the global spread of communism by the Soviet Union. Now overshadowing all was the threat of nuclear holocaust. Varying in intensity over 4.5 decades, the Cold War took many forms: political, economic, ideological, and cultural. It also included an arms race, and on several occasions, armed conflict. Despite vast numbers of tanks, guns, warships, and other conventional weapons, the defining feature of the Cold War arms race always was nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. The United States came to see nuclear forces chiefly in terms of deterrence. The threat of retaliation was the means to discourage nuclear attack. To put teeth into the threat of retaliation, the United States developed 3 independent systems: bombers, land-based missiles, and submarines, all equipped to deliver nuclear weapons. It was called the Strategic Triad. Each component of the triad was capable of inflicting catastrophic damage and millions of casualties. Ballistic missile submarines, being difficult to locate, were most likely to survive nuclear attack. This exhibition, Fast Attacks and Boomers, Submarines in the Cold War, describes how the Navy developed this new kind of weapon system after World War II. It shows how nuclear-powered submarines are built and maintained, how they operate, and what they have meant for American policy and strategy. It also tells the story of the submarine crews and their families, Americans on the front lines of the Cold War.
Bridge number 200 yards to the turn, stand by the turn. Outcome last year was 141.
The officer of the deck or commanding officer is in charge of the ship whenever a submarine is underway. All their directions and orders are controlled through the attack center. The attack center is the submarine's central control station. When a submarine is operating on the surface, operations are directed from the bridge. When the submarine dives and operates submerged, ship's activities are overseen from the attack center. Submarines conduct many different operations. In support of these operations, personnel in the attack center and nearby areas help navigate the ship, steer it, control its depth, operate sonar, radar, radio, and other sensors, and monitor the operation of essential support systems.
Man battle stations.
Man battle stations, Man battle stations.
To ensure readiness, the ship and crew train at battle stations to launch torpedoes and missiles.
Shoot. Fire.
They conduct casualty drills, to practice damage control in the event of fires or other onboard emergencies. These require all hands. Submarines might be assigned to support a carrier battle group, conduct anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare, insert and extract a SEAL detachment, or conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. They may track potential hostile ships or submarines, or conduct training exercises with other U.S. ships. Whether a submarine is conducting routine operations, completing a strategic deterrent patrol, or is underway on a complex multi-mission deployment, the attack center serves as the nerve center of the ship, constantly manned from the time the ship leaves port until it returns home. Video reenactments of an anti-submarine warfare tracking operation, surveillance of a surface-to-air missile test, and an underwater hull survey training exercise, operations conducted by attack submarines, may be viewed by actuating buttons contained on the sloped rail surrounding the attack center display.
Sonar gain news for crate demonstrates bearing 055 designates Sierra 63, initially classified possible submarine.
Sonar, can I?
Helm, all head 1/3.
All head 1/3, Helm, aye. Officer deck, maneuvering on head 1/3.
Very well, Helm.
Sonar Sierra 63 is doing 7 knots on 2 5-bladed screw, currently classified at Yankee SSBN, bearing 054, drawing left.
Sonar, can I? Sonar con designates Sierra 63 as Master 5.
Designated Sierra Master 5, Sonar.
Chief of the watch, station the section tracking party.
Station second tracking party, Austin. Captain.
This is the officer of the deck. We've detected a Yankee class SSBN doing 7 knots on 2 5-bladed screws, currently bearing 0.
USS Batfish has just detected a Soviet Yankee-class missile submarine as the Yankee transited to the Atlantic Ocean.
Tracking party. I currently intend to track the Yankee. He is currently designated Master 5.
Very well, Officer.
Inform me when you have a solution.
Inform you when I have a solution, aye, Captain.
Batfish had crossed the Atlantic, tasked to locate and track the Yankee SSBN using passive sonar while remaining undetected. U.S. attack submarines were assigned to follow Soviet missile submarines for extended periods, tracking their movements and ready to attack if the Soviet SSBNs launched missiles. Batfish followed the Soviet submarine as it patrolled within range of targets in the United States. The attack sub's crew became familiar with the Soviet sub's routine, making the mission appear uneventful. Uneventful, except for the times the Yankee did the unexpected.
Sonar Master 5, noise level has faded. No longer hold contact. Last good bearing 035.
All stations con, possible target Zig, Master 5. Analyze for solutions. Helm right, 5 degrees rudder, steady course 150.
Right 5 degrees rudder, steady course 150. Off that, my rudder is right 5.
Very well, Helm. Helm all stop.
All stop, Helm, aye. Off that, maneuvering says all stop.
The U.S. submarine used passive sonar ranging tactics to determine the target's position while remaining at a safe distance. The target submarine's depth was not precisely known, adding a degree of uncertainty to the tracking mission.
Solution on Master 5.
Sonar regained passive sonar contact on Master 5, bearing 030. Target has zigged and is now drawing sharply to the left.
Sonar con I.
Sonar Master 5 has increased speed, now making 10 knots.
Sonar con I. Helm on 1/3.
Ahead 1/3, Helm, aye.
Attention to the tracking party. The Yankee appears to be clearing baffles. I intend to maneuver to keep him just aft of our port beam until we develop a good solution.
Sonar Master 5 continues to draw left, now bearing 020, still 10 knots.
Sonar con I.
Off the deck, we have a solution. Best target course is course 270, speed 10 knots, range 6,800 yards. The target reverse course to the west.
Very well, plot.
Sonar, target noise level is decreasing. He appears to be slowing.
Sonar con I.
Sir, plot solution shows that Master 5 is on course 270. Target's at 7 knots in opening.
Very well, plot. Helm wide 2/3, left 10 degrees rudder, steady course 290.
Ahead 2/3, Helm, aye. Off that, maneuvering ahead 2/3. Left 10 degrees rudder, steady course 290. Off that, my rudder is left 10.
Very well, Helm.
Captain, sir, officer of the deck. The Yankee has completed in their baffle clear. He has used a course reversal and is now heading to the west at 7 knots. I do not believe we were detected.
Batfish had tracked the Soviet SSBN for 50 days until the Yankee began its transit home. Batfish had been away for over 2 months and had followed the SSBN for nearly 9,000 miles.
Observation on the cruiser, number 2 scope.
Speed 4 knots, depth 63 feet, 087, fire control ready.
Up scope.
This submarine has been operating in international waters and has observed preparations by a foreign navy to test a new surface-to-air missile system.
Bearing, mark.
086.4.
Range, mark. 1.8 divisions. High power.
8,500 yards.
Angle on the bow, port 95. XO, report fire control solution.
Launch ship is on course north, speed 5 knots, range 8,500 yards, Captain.
Hey, very well, XO.
Sonar and periscope video recording systems are ready to capture acoustic and visual intelligence from the launch. In spite of a vast and successful U.S. space surveillance capability during the Cold War, some activities conducted by foreign countries could not be observed from space. The submarine's stealth and endurance allows it to covertly observe these activities. This submarine's commanding officer has positioned his submarine to safely observe the launch ship, the missile flight, and its impact with the target. The goal is to gather valuable intelligence while remaining undetected. A challenge with the submarine at periscope depth, with antennas and periscopes exposed.
The cruiser is getting ready to launch. Attention in the attack center. I intend to monitor the missile launch. We're going to raise number 2 scope to collect visual intelligence. Sonar will be recording the launch. Officer deck, start all recording equipment. Observation cruiser number 2 scope.
Speed 4 knots, depth 63 feet, bearing 087, fire control ready.
Up scope. Bearing, mark.
086.4.
Range, mark. 1.8 divisions, high power.
8,500 yards.
Angle on the bow, port 95.
Check.
I intend to leave the scope up. It appears the cruiser is about ready to launch. There goes the missile. Impact, explosion on the target. There's a piece of debris falling on this bearing. Mark the bearing.
135.
Going back, mark the bearing to the explosion.
148.
And the debris falling into the water.
Bearing 125.
Lowering number 2 scope, down scope. Dive make it up 150 feet.
Make it up 150 feet. I full dive on the fairwater planes. 5 down.
Intelligence collected by submarines during the Cold War provided a better understanding of the capabilities of foreign navies to ensure a military advantage in the event of hostilities.
Bearing, mark.
356.4.
Range, mark. 8 divisions, high power.
3,500 yards.
Angle of the bow. Starboard 175. Down scope.
As the great mobility, endurance, and stealth of the nuclear submarine became better understood, operators improved their skills and techniques through realistic training.
Report current solution on the destroyer.
Destroyer is on course north at 5 knots, range 3,500 yards.
Farewell plot.
One of the training missions involves viewing and videotaping of the underwater hull of another ship for intelligence about its equipment and capabilities. This training ensures the submarine can safely accomplish this mission should the need arise. This understandably delicate operation requires controlling the depth of the submarine within a foot or so, and its speed within a fraction of a knot.
Attention fire control party, I intend to conduct an underhull surveillance of a United States destroyer. We're going to conduct one more observation, firm up the course and speed of the destroyer, and then go deep and raise the scope and commence filming of the destroyer. Observation destroyer, number 2 scope.
Speed 4 knots, depth 63 feet, bearing 355.
Up scope. Bearing, mark.
356.4.
Range, mark. 8 divisions, high power.
2,000 yards.
Angle of the bow. Starboard 175. Down scope. dive, make it up 105 feet.
Make it up 105 feet, dive I. Full dive on the fairwater planes, 3 down.
Chief the watch maneuvering, make turns for 6 knots.
To maneuver, make turns for 6 knots. Chief the watch aye.
The commanding
Attention,
officer has
fire control
positioned the
party, 10 to,
submarine
go
astern
deep.
of the warship
We'll get behind the
and
destroyer,
confirmed
I'll
its
raise the
range.
scope and we'll commence
He is adjusting
sail.
speed to slowly move closer and moving to a depth that will give a safe separation between the top of the periscope and the bottom of the destroyer.
Upscope. Sonar mark bearing to the destroyer.
Con sonar destroyer bears 355.5.
Sonar con eye. Mark this bearing.
356.4.
I hold the destroyer. Chief the watch maneuvering, make turns for 5 knots.
Control me 5 knots per load.
I can make out 2 screws clearly now. There are 5 blades on each screw. The rudders are after the screws. The hull appears to be very clean, well maintained and preserved. There are no other underwater appendages I can see back here other than the rudder and the screws. Slowly moving up the port side, there are no other openings. Okay, I can now start making out what appears to be his sonar dome. It's a large bulbous dome on the bow. Looks like it is coated with some type of material. It's not the same as the hull. Helm left 15 degrees rudder. Dive make it up 150 feet. Lowering number 2 periscope. Very well, helm. Okay, attention fire control party. I intend to open out the destroyer. We're going to set up again to do this. We're going to let the executive officer make an approach on the destroyer.
As in all submarine operations, this requires teamwork by a well-trained crew and practice during training exercises. Practice that ensures each submarine can successfully perform even the most complex missions.
Okay. Because I'm going to pull off and let the EXO do it. You know, the most important job that a CO has, if he doesn't go to war, is to train somebody behind him that does go to war. In fact, one of the pieces of advice I got early on is, if you do okay as a CO, fine, that's a tribute to who trained you. The real measure of how did you do is how well your EXO does when he goes to command. You know, so Mike did pretty good. He commanded 3 weeks. I feel justified. Okay. Mike, I'll give you a copy of this.
They said that, or you said the pinging was the active sonar. Did the destroyer have any idea?
No. First of all, you know, an active sonar, you hear nothing. There's something called near field effect. You're not going to get any returns from anything that's very close. So particularly coming up from behind, and he's baffled he can't ping behind. And I was on one ship, my first ship, the skipper, we're coming into Norfolk. And there's a destroyer, we're submerged, we're coming in, and the sonar picked up the destroyer, determined who it was, and was the skipper of the destroyer was a classmate of the skipper of my submarine. So he said, okay, go ahead and get under the ship so we can get under the destroyer. And he picks up the underwater telephones, and his call sign was Brandywine. You know, he says, so-and-so, whatever the call sign was, this is Brandywine himself. Go wake up, what's it called, himself, and tell him it's time to go to the bathroom. So, that had to come as a shock to the guy at the bridge. But we were talking about missiles and watching the missiles and all that, again on my first ship. We're on station when watching the early Russian SSGNs had SSGs, diesel-powered guided missile submarines. SSGs. Anyway, they had to erect them. They had to surface and erect the missile in the sail and get it ready, and then they'd shoot it from there. And so we were watching this one guy, and we were watching him for hours and hours, and the skipper's watching, and he's on service. He's got the missile erected and all. And finally said, Jim, I got to go to the bathroom. Here, take a scope. You know, I got okay, let's go. He had no sooner stepped off the periscope stand. I go, wow, look at that! What did you see? I said, oh, the big thing. What do you know that? It was Yogi Cup. But that was interesting. I wasn't prepared to take very careful notice of what was going on. Okay. Remember I told you about the acoustic advantage we had? This is out of that book Tom Stefanik talked about. And he had, as a function of time across the bottom, the different classes of U.S. submarines coming down and kind of the, the range of radiated noise that they have. First of all, you notice that between the Nautilus up here and down here, there's some 60 dB difference in radiated noise. That's a factor of 1,000,000. So modern submarines radiate 1,000,000th of the noise that Nautilus did. Okay. Here's the Russians trying to catch up Soviets. Bang! Something happened right there. Oh, wow. It's a good thing we kept getting better and better, because that would have really, spoiled our day. What had happened is Toshiba had sold them some very sophisticated milling machines that made quiet propellers. And so they, overnight, literally got about 20 dB quieter.
When was that? What's the year?
60s to late 80s.
80s, 75, 80, early 80s? Early 80s? And this is the same thing, just a little less cluttered, to make it. And then somebody asked me earlier about the different classes of submarines. The Escape class, the Skipjack class, the Threshers, Sturgeons, Los Angeles class. The quietest submarine in the U.S. fleet is the biggest. The noisiest was the smallest. The NR-1 was the noisiest submarine we had. Why? Because acoustic stealth is a volume-intensive art and skill. You need lots of room to put all the sound-absorbing stuff and mount it on a raft, and mount the raft on a raft, and all this stuff to keep radiated noise, vibration, from getting to the hull. Something can vibrate all at once as long as it doesn't get to the hull. It gets to the hull, it gets into the water. Okay?
Where did the 671 fit into that? The narwhal.
The narwhal.
With the direct drive turbine.
She was pretty quiet. I would put her in with the 688s probably. She was a 637 class, basically.
Well, she had an actual cool
Yeah.
stuff. She was pretty innovative.
Yep, it was. It was.
I think it was only one of them, right?
Just one of them, right. And then there was a turbine electric drive. There were a couple of one of a kind that we played with. But that's what I told you earlier, what 40 dB represents is a 10,000 to 1 ratio or something. And that's kind of the advantage that I had as a CO and Mike had as a CO until Toshiba screwed it up. Now, everybody is in a tizzy since the end of the Cold War, the littorals. You hear this all the time. Oh my gosh, we got to operate in littorals. We could go to a littoral combat ship and all that. Well, littorals are it's nothing new to the submarine force. We've been in the littorals forever. And these are the littorals we operate in, the Barents Sea. If you remember that picture you saw tip of Norway, once you go around the corner up there in North Cape, the Soviets like to think that was their Mare Nostrum. The Barents. It's international waters, but it's not very deep. The Norwegian Sea is a littoral, Sea of Japan, Sea of Lacoste are all areas that we operated. I mentioned before that ISR has been our most important product all along. To collect information, order of battle. I told you about the IL-28 Beagle, the ballistic missile launch. That's been our bread and butter, and still is. One thing you see a submarine stick a periscope up. When you deploy, one of the metrics, one of the measures of effectiveness, of how good was your deployment, is what percentage of the time you were on station did you have an antenna up. Because if you don't have an antenna up, you're not getting everything that's available to be got. And typically, guys would run in the high 90% without an antenna. Okay? Now, you got to remember, today's modern submarine, when you stick a periscope up, you are vacuuming DC to light as far as the RF spectrum goes. You pretty much get everything down the periscope. Okay, it's a very complex piece. It's not just a pipe with two mirrors. It's a very complex thing. If anybody I didn't say this before, but anytime at all you have any questions or comment or something, throw them out. So I'm just winging it. But there's the Barents, and it's shallow. There's something called the MIZ, marginal ice zone, which can be as much as 100 or 200 miles deep. And it's from the edge of the ice pack, where there's 20% or less ice cover, to pack ice, which is 80% or more cover. That is probably the noisiest part of the ocean. The noisiest place in the whole world is the MIZ, marginal ice zone. Because all these things are bumping and crashing and hizzing. And ice sits there as it melts, it makes a hissing noise. And these little pockets of fresh water inside the ice are dispersing in bubbles inside the ice, but it's very, very noisy. And I can remember one time, as an OD, being at periscope depth and dealing with what they call Bergy bits. Bergy bit is a piece of ice the size of a house or the size of a Volkswagen, and that was everywhere. And I don't think I ever had a rudder course. The rudder was always right full or left full, and you knew if you ever dropped the scope, you'd never get it back up safely. And it was a harrowing 4 hours on watch. Yeah.
With the ice pack melting, it appears to be melting quicker. Now, would our submarines be able to give us more information about that by the noise and the activity that's going
Is it
on?
monitoring the rate of melting?
Yeah.
I don't think they would get anything more than you don't get from either space or aircraft observing the reduction.
It's not bad. He said it's a lot more.
Yeah, I'm sure we poke our nose in there, see if there is some undiscovered phenomena associated with the ice pack getting smaller. It gets easier. When Nautilus first tried to go under ice, when she tried to go across the North Pole, she left from Pearl Harbor, of course, and the thing was go through the Bering Straits and duck under. Nobody had really had much of an idea what they were going to find under there. The first time they tried, they got to a point where there was ice to the right, ice to the left, about 10 foot above them to the ice, and about 10 foot below them to the bottom, and getting shallow. So they were really stuck. Oh, they had to back out, back down, submerged several miles before they got a place, enough room to turn around, go back to Pearl Harbor. So, well, that didn't work. I think the problem was they didn't go. The Arctic summer occurs in October, September, October. That is when the ice is the thinnest, because the ocean has this delay. The warmest at the beach is in September, October. So it takes all summer to warm up. There's a huge thermal sink. It's like this ice is the thinnest. And so they went back in September, October, and it was still a tight fit, but they got in. And then there's a deep Arctic basin. So that was a piece of cake from there on. Except, one of the problems they had to face up with is, how do you point the ship? What is the course immediately before you reach the North Pole? Obviously, it's north. What is your course immediately after passing the North Pole, regardless of what direction the ship is pointed? The south. So how do you manage this thing? How do you drive the ship? What course do you want? They really had to configure, if you can imagine, taking the pole and artificially rotating at 90 degrees. So you had a grid system that made sense at the poles. In addition, they had taken an inertial navigation system off an Air Force missile. The ship's inertial navigation, it was the first ship's inertial navigation system. And that was helping them do the navigation. But
how would they navigate through the oil in the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, through the oil or the oil rigs?
No, the oil that's coming out.
The oil's not going to affect it too much. You may have to clean some of the condensers and all later, but it's not going to dramatically affect the ship. But my master's thesis at URI, Ocean Engineering, was, we ought to do something about things like oil rigs and big oil ships, VLCCs, very large cruise carriers, and have some acoustic sidelights on those, so that people know they're there, the submarines know they're there and can avoid them. You get in front of a big tanker, there's 1,000 foot of oil between you and the guy's propeller. And his propeller is deep enough and turning slow enough. They have big single. If you classify them as anything, you classify them as a submarine periscope depth. One large multi-blade propeller moving at tens of RPM. Okay, but there was actually a German submarine that hung up in an oil rig in the North Sea. He hung up for a couple of days before he got himself out, you know. Now, typically if the rig is working, it makes enough noise that you can hear it and avoid it. And navigation today is so precise with GPS. But, you know, once you leave periscope depth and go deep, then your uncertainty of position starts expanding with time. You have to figure that. When San Francisco ran into that mountain out in the Pacific, she had an absolutely precise navigational fix. I mean, she had just been in periscope depth, got GPS, she knew precisely where she was within a couple of 100 yards. But she had a poor navigational picture.
Outdated charts.
Well, we know more about the backside of the moon than we know about the bottom of the ocean.
Wow. She had outdated charts.
There's no such thing as a current chart. Huh?
She had outdated charts.
We had a chart that didn't give us the right information, which is probably true for any chart. Unless you're working here in Fisher Island Sound or something. You know that pretty well. But when I was driving Flasher to Pearl Harbor, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning, trucking along 400 feet and 15 knots and tired and wish we want to go to bed. And the fathometer's running because we're, you know, not concerned about detectability. And you hear the fathometer, it's clicks, click, clicks, click. You know. All of a sudden it's click, 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 click. Look over and here's the bottom coming up. Oh, sheesh, you know, I'll stop right forward, I'll make it down 50 feet, call a captain. And we would, if you look at the Hawaiian Islands and draw a line from Midway, you know, down through Oahu and all that, there's lots of other volcanoes down there to the southeast that are just in the process of making themselves another Hawaiian island in another million years. So we just flew over one. And by the charts, it was 2,000 fathoms of water.
But in a pickle, just call Ben Rothman.
Yeah. But that submerged volcano came up to about 1,000 foot to the surface. Now we weren't deep. We could have gone right over that and never known it. You know, but that was not the case with San Francisco. We found one that was tall enough to do. And that's a success story. You talk about driving a 6,000-ton thing into a mountain at, you know, 30, 40 mile an hour. You say, gee, and it survived? Yeah, one guy got killed. A lot of people got injured. You look at the pictures of that ship, and it's just incredible. It could survive. Tribute to EV. Yeah.
Fascinating, Captain Patton. I wondered if you'd be willing to comment on the big debate going now on female.
Well, my only comment is it's going to happen. You know, there were the naysayers about women at the Naval Academy and all that. And my friend and Mike's friend, Jerry Holland, was a battalion officer at the Naval Academy. His job was to make it work. So somebody in the submarine force is going to be tasked with make it work. And there's going to be some problems, and there's going to be a CO gets fired, and a squadron commander gets fired, and some flag officer gets fired because something didn't go right. But it'll work.
Why? Why do they need women on submarines?
Well, I'll tell you one reason. Because there's not enough men taking technical subjects. All men want to be financial advisors. Top-notch engineers and mathematicians and scientists rolling out of college now, American. Now, a lot of them are Indian and Chinese and all that, but the American engineers are women. And so it's, you know, we don't take just anybody into this play. You need a guy that's pretty smart. I had a division of 6 guys once, a reactor controls division. I was a reactor controls officer. Average intelligence of those enlisted guys was 130 IQ. Average IQ. Now, I could probably have fooled them once. that's all I could have fooled. But hey, it's a necessity. We need them. And they need the opportunity. You know? Now, there's some real problems when I have to discover. One of the real issues, and there's a submarine doctor, a Navy doctor, that's written a very good paper, very clinically, saying, now here are some of the issues. Talk about a sealed environment for 2 months at a time with very elevated CO2 levels, about 0.5%, you know, maybe 10 times what you have normally. Very, very deleterious to a fetus. So it's not so much a question about, hey, we don't want women getting pregnant while they're on board. the woman that goes on a deployment not knowing she's pregnant. And a lot of hazard to the fetus and other contaminants in the atmosphere. It takes about 3 weeks when we come back off a long deployment for the pH of our blood to get back to normal. Because of the high CO, and that's all that makes you want to breathe is the pH of your blood. That's why everybody's so tired when you get home, because the pH of your blood is saying, oh, you got plenty of oxygen, don't worry about it. And you say, oh, and you fall asleep. Okay? Norwegian,
Your blood's more acid than normal?
Because of the carbon dioxide, carbolic acid.
More acid.
More acid. Because the way it's designed, if you need to breathe more, the way the body senses that is there's too much CO2 in your blood. So the pH drops. So the pH drops says breathe harder. So you breathe harder when the pH drops. You get more oxygen, you get rid of some of the CO2, pH comes up, you start breathing yourself. Nothing in your system tells you don't have enough oxygen. There's great pictures of pilots, and they got their oxygen mask on. They're interviewing this guy, talking to him, and they'll turn off the oxygen. And he talks for another few seconds and bangs up. Turn the oxygen on, he comes right back and never knows he's been out. That's when the airplane says, put your mask on first. And then put it gets me. That's why. This is another area, probably some of the worst weather in the world. Now you do here get something called convergence zone. The convergence zone is where the sound energy from a target goes down, the water gets more dense from compression, it comes back up, and about 30 miles away it all reconverges. So you can hear a guy 30 miles away as well as if he was only 5 miles away. In between you don't have it. But that's great in deep water. You can hear these guys 1 or 2 or 3 convergence zones away and maneuver to get there. But if it's shallow water, much more than, it has to be about 3,000 pounds or so to get a CZ. A few words, very short. GI-UK gap, right? GI, Greenland, Iceland, UK. Classic place. You saw that Victor come down, the Yankee come down. They got smart enough to realize if they ran down the mid-Atlantic ridge, okay, where the water's not deep enough to have a deep sound channel, then our sources couldn't get them. So they're pretty smart. And Iceland is nothing more than part of the mid-Atlantic ridge that sticks out of the water. But we had SOSUS stations in the UK and in Iceland, all over the place. Sea of Japan, deep water, you do get secretion zones. A lot of strategic importance there. Because I'm talking Cold War now. One of the real considerations in any kind of war planning was keeping Japan at least neutral. Keep her, in your side, because you were flying aircraft out of Japan, you needed Japan, if not so much for a military power, at least a neutral power. And to do that, you had to make sure they saw indications that the war was going the correct way. So what you really wanted on the nightly news in Japan every night to see some Soviet cruisers burning.
What's the Russian base there?
Vladivostok. Blind Man's Bluff tells a story about a skipper of a submarine called Gudgeon, who happened to be my first skipper in Scorpion. And the story says that he was escorted out of Vladivostok Harbor, having exhausted his battery. And that's the story. That's what the book says. But that's a submarine port. Submarine, huh?
He was escorted out of...
He was Seal Gudgeon.
Yeah. The ship was escorted.
The ship was escorted.
Yeah, I understand that. Because the exhausted was obviously to come up and charge.
That was a diesel.
Okay.
Could I ask you while you're there? Excuse me.
Yeah.
While you're on that slide?
Yes.
I'd be curious, what's your opinion of, or your insight to what happened with the South Korean corvette? And why we didn't, is there not a SOSUS kind of system in that area?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, shallow water. You don't do SOSUS in shallow water.
Okay.
You got to have a deep sound channel, which is 700 fathoms, something like that. So no SOSUS in shallow water. The SOSUS system has been pretty much decommissioned. It's only a shadow of its own self. It's used now for a lot of scientific research, tracking whales with it and stuff like that, but most of the stations have been shut down.
You might show them where it is in the book.
Yeah, there's the Yellow Sea. Very shallow water. Very shallow water. Now, I thought at first when that happened, oh, they must have found a bottom mine left over from, but the evidence is conclusive that it was a torpedo.
Right.
Because the water's shallow enough to have a bottom mine. It's 120, 150 foot deep, something like that.
But the U.S. ships were operating in the area with the South Koreans doing games and stuff, and were unable to detect.
Well, you know, these midget submarines don't go anywhere. I mean, this thing had to be. There is a hazard to always doing things the same way. Okay, and one of the classic examples was that F-117 that got shot down in the Bosnia thing. The 117s, unlike the B-2s, the B-2s, see, the Air Force is crazy. They don't have a stealth community. So it's a different crowd of people flying the 117s. They're fighter pilots, white scarf, and the bomber pilots.
Leather jackets. Yeah.
Okay, so the bomber pilots, when they were on the B-2s, they'd come in a different route each time. 117s were going in the same way every day, every night. And this guy that got shot down was the best guy they had. More missions, very successful. It was overcast. He overflew the target several times with his bomb bay open. And you light up like a Christmas tree with a bomb bay open because all that stealth technology doesn't work unless you got the doors shut.
Yep.
He finally decided to come down low and go under the cloud cover. And so they're just watching him go by. Every night they'd see him come by, and it was a piece of cake for him to shoot him down.
So are you...
these South Korean, where I'm getting at, these South Korean destroyers have been doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Yep.
And so this guy was just sitting there,
Yep.
waiting. So the target came to him.
Yeah. So the experts with your experience and your level of knowledge, you're not surprised at what happened?
I am surprised that even an irrational government would do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
as
I mean,
crazy as the North Koreans are.
Regardless of the political part, that technically they got away with it.
They got away with it.
Yeah.
And they fired a wake-home torpedo. And the only thing you have to tell a wake-home torpedo is when you see the wake, turn right.
Point.
Or when you see the wake, turn left. That's all you got to tell it.
Yeah.
So it goes out and says, there's a wake. They told me to turn right. Turn right, haul the wake up, went off under the ship, is why they blew it in half.
Yeah.
You know, magnetic exploder.
Yeah.
And, yeah, it's, but it's very shallow water in there.
In the time you guys were operating, late 70s, 80s, early 80s, wasn't that the time that one of our own people sold information on
Walker, Whitworth.
underwater sound system?
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the Walker Whitworth affair. The one thing that nobody ever believes someone else is reading their mail. Okay, go back as far as you want. We didn't believe that the Japanese were reading our radio transmissions in World War II. Germans didn't believe we were reading theirs in World War II. You know, we didn't believe that the North Vietnamese were reading, you know, encrypted messages in Vietnam. And the one thing, the submarine force probably lost less information than the rest of the Navy because of Walker Whitworth, who was involved with communications and was giving stuff to the Soviets, because we don't talk that much. Okay? We don't talk that much. Well, the rest of the Navy is yapping all the time. And that saved an awful lot of information. But we do, if we pull out a station and we send a highlights message. Hey, here's the really hot stuff we're bringing back. You know, you can get the radar patrol report when you get home. That kind of stuff was getting to the Soviets. Now, the biggest thing that got to them, they knew they were acoustically inferior. They had no idea just how acoustically inferior they were. Okay? They would do things, they had a pretty good idea where the social stations were. So what they would do would start sneaking in, and they're watching for a response. They're watching for circuits to come up and airplanes to take off. And so what we were doing, the sneaky SOBs we are, we're playing poker, they're playing chess. That's how the Cold War worked out the way it did. They're playing chess, we're playing poker. Well, we'd pick up this guy 1,000 miles away and say, okay, I know what he's doing. He's going to try to see when we react. So let's not react till he's 200 miles away from the array. So we, 200 miles, oh my God, there's a submarine there. Say, okay, that guy, that range is 200 miles. You know, so manipulating the data. Okay, we used to do that with, if you remember during the late 40s, early 50s, every once in a while there'd be a B-47 shot down up in the Barrens. Remember that? So, oh, geez, those damn Russians. Wow, what we were doing, we were running in to their radar network to sample when they reacted. You know, when did they send fighters up and all? And then, you know, and every once in a while we get caught. Get shot down. Price of poker. But it's an interesting game that was played. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, thank you.
Okay. Sea of Accost. I didn't talk about it, but this is where they kept some of their SSBNs. Sea of Accost. They learned early on, so we would go in deep ocean with our SSBNs. And we developed longer range missiles, so we got more and more of the deep ocean to use as a patrol zone. They developed longer range missiles to pull their platforms back closer and closer and closer to the homeland. Towards the end, in the Barents, where they had their SSBNs, were in little nooks and crannies. You know, with minefields in front of them and sonar systems in front of them, because they knew if they went in the open ocean, they'd get eaten alive. Okay? So what they did in the Pacific, this is a very, very, very quiet piece of water. And there's something on a clear day everybody can see forever. So even though so you had this huge acoustic advantage, the acoustic advantage was such that you still couldn't get close enough to them without hearing. So that was a good place for those to put that there. Very, very quiet. It's analogous to the pioneers going across the Great Plains, and when they parked their wagons at night, they picked the biggest open field they could find. Because they knew the Indians could see them there, but the Indians could see them when they're in the woods too. But at least in the big open field, they could see the Indians while they were still outside of arrow range. You know, so that was kind of the concept of the Soviet boomers up there. Okay, some submarine losses. I was asked earlier, you know, what about pressure? Pressure was on sea trials following an overhaul out of Portsmouth. Very, very controlled. They had a bunch of riders aboard, about 129 people aboard. A lot of riders out of EB and SIP ships down here in Groton. And they had a submarine rescue ship with them, and they were in communications with them. And they were going down to do a deep dive, going on a test step. And they reported they were having a minor problem trying to service. You know, and they heard them trying to blow. And what the minor problem was, there's a lot of conjectures. A lot of people say, well, clearly it was some massive flooding that caused the reactor scram. And then they had no propulsion power to get shallow, and the blow system was inadequate. We didn't know the blow system was inadequate, so the pressure happened. But in any case, she was lost with some 129 people. The thing that came out of that, first of all, everything stopped. Overnight, everything stopped. All ships construction stopped. I was on a submarine in Newport News, and we were supposed to have our naval reactors exam the day after Thresher sank. The naval reactors came aboard, and they asked a few questions, and they left. They said, don't call us, we'll call you. We didn't know if we passed, did we fail, what's going on? For about 3 months, we didn't know. You know, we were sitting there ready to go critical, and we didn't know what the story was. Well, they've gone back to the drawing board, and they did lots of things. For example, at the time of Thresher's loss, if you had a reactor scram, you shut the main steam stops, immediate action. Because you didn't ever want to be adding reactivity to the reactor in 2 different ways, both by drawing steam and pulling rods. That turned out to be a big mistake, because what you got all that stored energy in the temperature of the primary coolant. In an emergency, so rods are on the bottom, you can still draw steam. One of the questions I was asked at the Naval Reactors exam that we never knew if we passed or failed, how long could you answer a standard bell if you scrammed and just answered the bell? I said, well, you're supposed to try to answer 1 or 2. They said, no, but suppose you didn't. And I said, oh, you got this right on BTUs, 4 or 5 minutes. And I said, okay, thank you very much. That was about the right answer. You know, but 4 or 5 minutes of a standard bell, 15 knots or so worth of power, can get you shallow in a hurry. We found out that the blow system went back to specifications written in the 20s. It said that you should have enough air to be at periscope depth, be at periscope depth, completely empty your main ballast tanks at the surface, then immediately redive to periscope depth and still have enough air left to completely empty your ballast tanks again. That sounds pretty cool. You know, that's lots of air. No consideration given at that time, in the 20s, to what if you're many, many, many hundreds of feet deep and the air doesn't take up as much room as it used to? How much air do you have now? Not much. So let's double the air bank capacity. We double the air bank capacity on the Thresher class submarines. Okay. And what is the rate at which the air goes into the tank? How fast? What is the rate of deballasting? Well, on Thresher, the rate of deballasting at test depth was about 250 pounds a second. If you got a 6-inch leak, you're flooding at 12 tons a second. So that wasn't very smart. So we totally redesigned the blow system. So instead of bringing air into the ship, running it through a reducer, and then putting it back in the ballast tanks through little pipes, we kind of bent it right around through big pipes and emptied the air banks right at 4,500 psi, their pressure, right into the ballast tanks. And boy, I tell you, that was a ride. I was on the first safe submarine, and we did emergency blow from test depth, and had to fight to keep the angle down below 30 degrees, but we hit the surface with a 15-knot vertical velocity. 15 knots vertically. And it was one of these, whoa! You'd have paid $1 for that at a carnival. So major, major changes. And a very close pedigree of every piece of equipment that was critical to the safety of the ship, called subsafe equipment. Scorpion, we don't know what happened. We know a lot of things that did not happen. It was not the result of enemy action. There was not an external explosion. Okay, we've looked at the wreck, we've looked at the wreckage. Recently, a very, very renowned SOSUS figure by the name of Bruce Rule, big name in SOSUS, took another look at some of the archived data with better processing we have available now, and what he determined is really world-shaking, is 22 minutes before the sound of the hull collapse. There were 2 small events a half a second apart, each of which represented the equivalent of 5 or 10 pounds of HE, high explosion. And points very strongly to a battery explosion, hydrogen explosion of battery. And a good friend of mine that was shipmates on Scorpion with me, and then he went back as XO and was relieved as XO just before the ship started home from the Med, has always been convinced that it was associated with flooding through the trash disposal unit. And if you can put a scenario together, because we really feel confident we can handle any single casualty. Be it flooding, be it a battery problem, be it a reactor scram, we can handle that. It's when you get a couple stacked up against you, multiple casualties. And one of the very critical scenarios is problem with the TDU, they get some flooding, they secure the flooding, you got an emergency closure valve for the TDU, however there's a bunch of water got in the ship, you're doing a battery charge, battery well's open, a bunch of water gets in the battery well, because of the flooding you secure the ventilation, you're now generating hydrogen, things can go to hell in a handbasket pretty quick. The hydrogen being what it does, concentrates in the upper level operations compartment, in the 7th battery well, and there's a pop in the ops compartment that disables the ship control party, and there's another pop downstairs in the battery well. And meanwhile, people back aft don't know what's going on, but you've lost your ability to control the ship. Okay? And we'll never know exactly what happened, but yeah.
Wasn't one of the possibilities that a torpedo on board the ship?
That was one of the early possibilities. One of the early things was the, you talked about the Mark 37 torpedo, and the Warshawk has a silver zinc battery that has potassium hydroxide as an electrolyte, that when you fire the weapon, a squib fires, and then potassium hydroxide drops down, and you activate the battery. And the battery now is in seawater. The concept was if you inadvertently activated the battery in the rack, in the torpedo room, then you generate a lot of heat, because the internal losses and internal discharges and all that. Conceptually, you could generate enough heat. Now you can shut down the motor just by turning on the 155 degrees. That'll keep the anti-circular burn, will shut down the motor, but you still get the battery activated. And the concept was you could conceivably generate enough heat to have a low-order detonation of the warhead, 200 or 300 pounds of HPX, which would ruin your whole day inside the torpedo room. But the damage to the torpedo room does not justify that. And what we saw on Kursk, with a little problem turning into a huge problem, the sympathetic detonation of all the other stuff in the torpedo room blew the front end off the Kursk. And there was no evidence of that kind of, tremendous. So that's been somewhat discredited. Somewhat discredited. Because there was right after that happened, a message came out and said, hey, when you're stringing these A cables together, A cable is what you plug into the breech door and then plug into the torpedo to get the information back and forth. And you have a test set, and you can string A cables together to hook up torpedoes to the test set. And it's physically possible to put them 180 out. And if you did put them 180 out and power up the test set, you would activate the battery. Oh, maybe they did that. Well, that was very credible until other evidence showed that that's probably not the case. Now, meanwhile, Soviets have been having lots of fun with bad things. Every one of these casualties on the Soviets can be tracked back to poor training, inadequate cross-training, not enough people. Most submarine forces can't get enough people to man their submarines to the level we man them. We man submarines to the level we man them, not to run them, not to fight them, but for casualties. You could run a submarine, you could run a U.S. submarine with 12 people. You could fight it with 15 people. But you need 130 people to be prepared to fight any kind of conceivable casualty that could happen. Soviets didn't have one. For example, this Mike, the one that sank up off North Cape. In fact, that happened as we were filming the movie. There was a minor fire started in the engine room. Compartment number 7, I think they called it. Minor fire. The guy reported it, and then it passed out. And if you track that casualty, the ship was doing all the right things, 5 or 10 minutes too late. And the casualty just kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And seals started melting between compartments, the noxious gases rode through the submarine. They're on the surface now. And I think eventually it got so hot, that it was such a deep diving ship, they couldn't emergency blow with air, so they had essentially solid fuel rockets in the ballast tanks. There's a one-shot emergency surfacing. You light off these solid fuel things. But if you light them off, there's no back pressure. The gas generation is so great that the floodgates can't pass it, and ballast tanks can peel off. So one of the conjectures are that they cooked off the solid-state emergency surfacing things in the ballast tank, and the ballast tanks peeled off, and they sank. And a couple of guys got out in an emergency escape chamber. The Kursk, for a long time we were blamed at Consigmat. We did have a couple of guys up there, that recorded the events, but they were not involved in initiating them. But that was just, again, there was one guy there was nobody in the torpedo room. There was an unmanned torpedo room, and they had video monitors, and they had automatic weapons transfer and all that kind of stuff. And when I talked to the graduating classes at the basic enlisted school, I said, one of you guys on Kursk, on the 7-part phones, could have stopped that casualty. Like, Captain, stop, don't do that, you know, something's wrong. One of those injection is they loaded a weapon into the tube and kind of missed the tube. Another one was that hydrogen peroxide, very high concentration of hydrogen peroxide and copper reacted and started a fire, which caused the warhead detonation. Okay, I'm losing my audience. There's the questions. Now I'll start this around. Who's got some questions?
First.
That was Ollie's job. Ollie will put in for you. Anything, guys? Well, I really appreciate. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What are the Russians doing now?
The Russians are maintaining core capability. The last thing they would ever give up militarily was a good submarine. They'd give up surface navy, they'd give up airplanes, they'd give up tanks, but they'll keep a good. If you want to be a global power, then you need nuclear submarines. If you want to protect your own shores, you need the best non-nuclear submarine you can buy. I just came back to Germany, and boy, they built some good ones. But if we had to protect the Gulf of Mexico, that's what we'd want to buy. But what we need to do, we need to be able to go halfway around the world real quick and stay there a long time. Yeah.
What about the Chinese now?
They're coming on strong. They're coming on strong. Their first nuclear submarines were kind of like our Nautilus in the Soviet Union, very noisy, kind of popular. But the next ones in line are very good. And they've got some very good non-nuclear submarines because they do have a need to protect their own waters. They have a bona fide need for very good non-nuclear submarines. And they'd like to establish themselves as a global maritime entity. So they need nuclear submarines. So they and the Soviets, they and the Russians have reason to have both. The Indians are coming right along too. Yeah.
As a sailor, we went down to spent a lot of time in the Bahamas, and were at a local village where the AUTEC bases were, where I guess you were doing a lot of sound activity. But one of the things that the guy said is when you are sailing, we used to, when we would go off soundings, we would turn off our depth sounder, and they said, no, you leave that depth sounder on, because not only can the whales hear you, but so can the submarines. So we kept our depth sounder.
Good idea. Your acoustic sidelights.
Yeah.
Yes.
When you projected the picture of the missile cruisers firing the missile, and took the picture from the blue periscope, you said that the Navy picks up a lot of material which we can then analyze. How do you do that in broad daylight? That picture was taken in broad daylight. You didn't go up there.
No, we wouldn't pick up this. Now, some of that stuff's sunk in shallow water. It's fair game. You know, the Chinese are reported to have almost a carbon copy of our Mark 48 torpedo. That they allegedly, found one in shallow water and reverse engineered. In fact, another funny story. There was this gentleman that built Mark 48 torpedoes for the Gould Company down in Glen Burnie, Maryland. And he was approached by some Japanese representatives. And they said, hey, we've talked to your State Department and we want to buy some Mark 48 torpedoes. What's the price? He says, how many do you want? And they said, 200. And he said, okay, but here's the price for 200. And you've got all the export permissions and all that. So they went off and they came back in a while. They said, we still want to buy some, but we want to change the quantity. He said, well, how many do you want now? They said, 2. What's the price? He said, the same. He said, they're not going to reverse engineer me.
Jim, let's tell him about the Glomar pile, about recovering stuff.
Oh, the Glomar Explorer?
Glomar Explorer,
yeah.
Project Jennifer. Yeah, that was quite a feat. I'm certainly not on the inside track on that, but what I do know from what I've read, allegedly what I've read, of course the cover story was we're going to recover manganese modules from the bottom of the ocean. Manganese nodules. Deep sea mining, yeah. So you have this whole huge ship with this huge moon pool and these big grabbers. And what apparently, this was a Gulf-class submarine. And it was one of those that had 3 missiles in the sail and they had to erect them on the surface to shoot them and all that. And what is postulated is that one of them inadvertently ignited. The Soviets had this awful issue with liquid fuel rockets. You know, our Polaris have always been solid fuel. But when they lost that Yankee up Bermuda, to digress a little bit, and again an example of no training, one of the missiles started leaking in the missile tube. And now the 2 things that are in there are red fuming nitric acid and hydrazine, you know, both of which react violently with water and really violently with one another. It's V2. It's V2 technology. So the only guy on board that knew anything about the missile at all was the weapons officer. Okay, so he's down at the bottom of the tube with his head in the manhole cover, and he's trying to, you know, deal with this leak. And there's a minor explosion. Bang, kills him. Now nobody knows what the hell's going on. So they start pumping the stuff into the potable water tanks, where it's reacting with water, and they're getting nitric oxide and this oxide and cyanide, and all this bad stuff is filling the boat. Everybody starts dying. You know, so finally the leak gets worse, and the missile explodes, blows itself out the tube into the Atlantic or Bermuda somewhere. There's a SS-6 Serb down there somewhere. SS-6 Serb. But by now they're on the surface. Below decks is untenable. We show up and say, hey, can we help you? You know, maritime and all that. No, we're okay. Don't worry about us. And Soviet tugboat showed up and they started towing them back. And 3 days after they started towing them back, the ship ended up and went down stern first. And what turned out to be the damage mechanism that caused the sinking of the ship, and it was one we'd never considered in all sorts of damage mechanisms, is when that missile exploded, the whipping action in the hull fractured the shaft seals. And so they were leaking along both shafts and didn't have any electrical power to run any pumps to pump out the water, and eventually just filled out the engine room and sank. Again, nobody knew what was going on. No one was trained. One of the things I was asked when I was out at Fairmont, because it was apparent when we started filming that the actors playing the roles in Dallas wouldn't work. We had to get some real sailors. So we got some real sailors up to play the roles. And the officer of the deck, all those guys were honest God sailors. We got them from San Diego, and I called up Portsmouth because the Dallas was in overhaul. I said, this is your ship. You could have sent something. So they sent a second-class quartermaster. And he got a speaking part, so it means he's got his own trailer. His speaking part was when the captain said, how long will it take us to get there? He said, 45 minutes, Captain, or something like that. That was his line. He had a trailer and a higher pay scale. He had to join the Actors Guild. But
recovery.
They asked me, would you help us interview, put ads in papers all over the country that we want to get real ex-Russian sailors, submarines. Would you help us? Well, they got lots of applicants. So you'd be talking to these guys, and you say, okay, what was your job? I was electrical officer on a Foxtrot class diesel submarine. Oh, okay. What kind of battery do you have? 120 volt AC battery. Okay, next guy. And I was talking to this one guy, and I said, what was your job? He said, I was reactor operator on an Echo class nuclear powered cruise missile submarine. Okay, so I started asking him some reactor theory questions, and he got enough and missed enough to say, maybe this guy is real. You know, he'd forgotten some stuff, but he remembered some other stuff. So finally I said, okay, well tell me a little bit about the missiles that your ship had. He said, oh, wait a minute. He said, I was a reactor operator. I was not encouraged to, or wasn't allowed to know anything, learn anything about any other part of the ship except my job. This guy's real. This guy's real. So he got a part.
Yeah.
Yes?
I read somewhere, maybe it was this blind man's bluff, that the British do much better at ASW than we do because they have officers whose job is nothing but ASW instead of everybody having to know about the detail.
That's correct.
Not true, or would
Not, not true. A good friend of mine was asked by Admiral Rickle. He said, would you consider riding the Bob Pierce? Would you consider riding this British submarine on his deployment? And report to me when you come back about how they did. So he rode, and he stood watch and all that. And the two things he came back, he says, hey, they're no better up front than we are. You know, in fact, I don't think they're as good. They're a little bolder sometimes, but sometimes too captive. But he said back aft, and he put an awful lot of effort into keeping the chemistry in the steam generators very, very precise to minimize corrosion. And you put in certain chemicals to keep it just right. Well, the engineer on this nuclear submarine had forgotten to bring any trisodium, disodium phosphate on control. They didn't do any chemistry on the steam generators for the entire deployment. And this captain never knew. He probably didn't care. And it was, Rickover went through the overhead on that. Almost forbid the Brits to use the range at Otek. Almost closed the range at Otek to the Brits. No, that's a British-inspired legend that they are better. But see, the price you pay, you have to find people that are good enough to do both. And there's not a lot of them. You know, maybe some of them will win it.
I've ridden U.S. surface ships a lot.
Yeah.
And on there, the disinterested sonar is monumental, I found. You were lucky if there was one among the officers at least that knew what the sonar did or cared much. They just sort of, you do your job, you tell us that there's a submarine, don't bother with detail.
Yeah, not the case on a submarine.
Yeah.
If there's, at least in our day, if you're out at sea and the skipper isn't eating or sleeping or watching the movie, chances are pretty good he's a sonar. And what we're fighting very much against is don't get us talking so much that the captain starts spending a lot of time in sonar and starts spending a lot of time in the radio shack. Okay?
You mentioned Rickover and submarine mitts. What's the rig for Rickover list?
Okay, over the years, Rickover has always ridden, he always rode the ship on first sea trials. He only missed 2. And those were because he had heart attacks. The only reason he missed those 2. But otherwise, he'd ride the ships on first sea trials. In the cruise mess on the ship, he would sign a letter personally to all of the congressmen, all the senators, all the high DOD and government officials, saying, I am at sea on USS so-and-so, da-da-da-da. And typically he would ask for something that it grew into such a myth. Every time he asked for something, it put on a list. So this list grew and grew and grew and grew. Because on Kamala, one of the things on the list, we had to have a Parker 51 pen in the shape of this pen, all these fancy pens for signing his letters. He sits down in the cruise mess, and he goes, and my chief yeoman, I was XO, he said, hey chief, you got a pen? He said, yeah. He pulls out one of the black, click, U.S. Navy military thing. Okay, thank you very much. He signed all the letters with that and gave it back to the chief. He's a very voracious reader. So you've got 4 or 5 bestseller books for him to read. You got him some power weather jackets and all that, which he would give away to congressmen and stuff like that. There's a word in the Navy called cumshot. Cumshot. The only good definition I heard of it is my friend Jerry Holland said, cumshot is the reallocation of government resources. Not necessarily with the government's knowledge, but always in the best interest of the government. So when you gave a guy at ED a can of coffee, and he fixed this valve right, that was in the best interest of the government. That was cumshot. That was the best interest of the government. But that's what Rickover did with most of the stuff. You gave it away to... Yes?
On strategy, you can hear this Soviet subs from a great distance. I understood that if we had ever gotten into something that looked like the Cuban Missile Crisis, what they would do is they would flood a small area with a lot of ships like the Greenland, Iceland, UK Capt coming down all together as a pack and then splitting and going, and so that you couldn't follow and couldn't be on the trail of everyone. You're saying the boomers, though, stayed closer and closer to the, instead of trying to get out into the open ocean like we did.
For a good part of my career, that's what I assumed. You know, that I looked at, you know, if we deployed to go to war on the earlier ships, we would go up and we'd park somewhere in that GIUK gap and wait for all these Russian submarines to come by and shoot them as they go by. It wasn't until the 70s, late 70s, when the intelligence community really took the Navy by the throat and said, listen, that's not what they're going to do with their submarines. That's what you would do with them if you had them. You aren't them. This is what they are going to do. They're going to protect the northern flank of the Red Army. They ain't going out in the Atlantic. They're staying home. So what we should do is go right downtown. As soon as we get unequivocal indications that they're going to come through the Fulda Gap in 3 weeks from now. And that's what intelligence community said. We'll give you 3 weeks of no nonsense, no bullshit. This is really what's going to happen. Then we deploy our submarines. And we don't sit there waiting for guys that aren't going to come. We go right downtown. We go right into Barents, go right into Sea of Accost, go right into the Northern Pacific. We go, and we're there, and we just start beating up on anybody we can find when the war starts. Okay, that was called the maritime strategy. And it was the right thing to do. Because they weren't going to serve. We thought they were going to do what the Germans did, come on and attack the sea lines of communication. No, not going to do that. You think back and you remember seeing Stalin or Khrushchev or whoever there on May Day, and you start counting the uniforms on either side of them. You went a long ways before you got to a Navy uniform. There were armies, generals, army generals, army generals. Now, what's happening in China is very interesting. Because again, China, PLA, the People's Liberation Army. In fact, the Navy is called the People's Liberation Army Parent N. But all the money started to flow, not to the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. Okay? And you'll know that they've come of age when all one day it's not the PLAN anymore, it's the PLN. People's Liberation Navy. Okay, I'm keeping everybody up.